The Black Widow of LaPorte is the name given to a serial killer that resided in and killed in LaPorte, luring her victims with the promise of financial union through marriage. She has an estimated body count of 42 victims, and whether or not she escaped the law is still up for debate. Her name Belle Gunnes. She was born in Selbu, Norway, on November 11, 1859, to Paul and Berit Storsett. She was the youngest of 8 children. An Irish TV documentary by Anne Berit Vestby, aired on September 4, 2006, tells a common, but an unverified, story about Belle's early life. The story holds that, in 1877, Belle attended a country dance while pregnant. There, she was attacked by a man who kicked her in the abdomen, causing her to miscarry the child. The man, who came from a rich family, was never prosecuted by the Norwegian authorities. According to people who knew her, her personality changed drastically. The man who attacked her died shortly afterwards. His cause of death was said to be stomach cancer. Having grown up in poverty, Belle took to service the next year on a large, wealthy farm and served there for 3 years in order to pay for a trip across the Atlantic. Following the example of a sister, Nellie Larson, who had emigrated to America earlier, Belle moved to the United States in 1881 and assumed a more American-style name. Initially, she worked as a servant in Chicago. While living with her sister and brother-in-law, she worked as a domestic servant, then got a job at a butcher's shop cutting up animal carcasses, until her first marriage in 1884. In 1884, Belle married Mads Anton Sorensen in Chicago, Illinois, and 2 years later, they opened a confectionery store. The business was not successful, and within a year the shop mysteriously burned down. The couple's home had also burned down. They collected the insurance for both, which paid for another home. Though some researchers assert that the Sorensen union produced no offspring, other investigators report that the couple had 4 children: Caroline, Axel, Myrtle, and Lucy. Caroline and Axel died in infancy, allegedly from inflammation of the large intestine. The symptoms of which, nausea, fever, diarrhea, and lower abdominal pain and cramping, are also symptoms of many forms of poisoning. Both Caroline's and Axel's lives were reportedly insured, and the insurance company paid out for both deaths. However, neighbors allegedly gossiped about the babies, claiming Belle never appeared to be pregnant. On June 13, 1900, Belle and her family were counted on the United States Census in Chicago. The census recorded her as the mother of 4 children, of whom only 2 were living: Myrtle A., aged 3, and Lucy B., aged 1. And an adopted 10-year-old girl, identified possibly as Morgan Couch but apparently later known as Jenny Olson, also was counted in the household. Sorensen died on July 30, 1900, reportedly the only day on which 2 life insurance policies on him overlapped. The first doctor to see him thought he was suffering from strychnine poisoning. However, the Sorensens' family doctor had been treating him for an enlarged heart, and he concluded that death had been caused by heart failure. An autopsy was considered unnecessary because the death was not thought suspicious. Belle told the doctor that she had given her late husband medicinal powders to help him feel better. She applied for the insurance money the day after her husband's funeral. Sorensen's relatives claimed that Belle had poisoned her husband to collect on the insurance. Surviving records suggest that an inquest was ordered. It is unclear, however, whether that investigation occurred, or Sorensen's body was ever exhumed to check for arsenic, as his relatives demanded. The insurance companies awarded her $8,500, that would be about $217,000 as of 2008, with which she bought a pig farm on the outskirts of LaPorte, Indiana. In 1901, Bell purchased a house on McClung Road. It has been reported that both the boat and carriage houses burned to the ground shortly after she acquired the property. As she was preparing to move from Chicago to LaPorte, she became reacquainted with a recent widower, Peter Gunnis, also Norwegian-born. They were married in LaPorte on April 1, 1902. Just 1 week after the ceremony, Peter's infant daughter died, of uncertain causes, while alone in the house with Bell. In December 1902, Peter himself met with a tragic accident. According to Bell, he was reaching for his slippers next to the kitchen stove when he was scalded with brine. She later declared that, in fact, part of a sausage grinding machine fell from a high shelf, causing a fatal head injury. A year later, Peter's brother, Gust, took Peter's older daughter to Wisconsin. She is the only child to have survived living with Bell. Her husband's death netted Bell another $3,000, some sources say $4,000. Local people refused to believe that her husband could be so clumsy. He had run a hog farm on the property and was known to be an experienced butcher. The district coroner reviewed the case and unequivocally announced that he had been murdered. He convened a coroner's jury to investigate the matter. Meanwhile, Jenny Olson, then 14, was overheard confessing to a classmate, saying, "My mama killed my papa. She hit him with a meat cleaver, and he died. Don't tell a soul." Jenny was brought before the coroner's jury but denied having made the remark. Bell, meanwhile, convinced the coroner that she was innocent of any wrongdoing. She did not mention that she was pregnant, which would have inspired sympathy, but in May 1903 a baby boy, Philip, joined the family. In late 1906 Bell told neighbors that her foster daughter, Jenny Olson, had gone away to a Lutheran college in Los Angeles. Some neighbors were informed that it was a finishing school for young ladies. But Jenny's body would later be found buried on her adoptive mother's property. Between 1903 and 1906 Bell continued to run her farm. In 1907 Bell employed a single farm hand, Ray Lamphy, to help with chores. Around the same time, Bell inserted the following advertisement in the matrimonial columns of all the Chicago daily newspapers and those of other large Midwestern cities.
Personal, comely widow who owns a large farm in one of the finest districts in LaPorte County, Indiana, desires to make the acquaintance of a gentleman equally well provided, with view of joining fortunes. No replies by letter considered unless sender is willing to follow answer with personal visit. Triflers need not apply.
Several middle-aged men of means responded to Bell's ads. One of these was John Moe, who arrived from Elbow Lake, Minnesota. He had brought more than $1,000 with him to pay off her mortgage, or so he told neighbors, whom Bell introduced him to as her cousin. He disappeared from her farm within a week of his arrival. Next came George Anderson from Takio, Missouri who, like Peter Gunnis and John Moe, was an immigrant from Norway. During dinner with Anderson, she raised the issue of her mortgage. Anderson agreed that he would pay this off if they decided to get married. Late that night, Anderson awoke to see her standing over him, holding a guttering candle in her hand and with a strange, sinister expression on her face. Without uttering a word, she ran from the room. Anderson fled from the house, soon taking a train to Missouri. The suitors kept coming, but none, except for Anderson, ever left Belle's farm. By this time, she had begun ordering huge trunks to be delivered to her home. Hack driver Clyde Sturgis delivered many such trunks to her from LaPorte and later remarked how the heavy-set woman would lift these enormous trunks, like boxes of marshmallows, tossing them onto her wide shoulders and carrying them into the house. She kept the shutters of her house closed day and night. Farmers traveling past the dwelling at night saw her digging in the hog pen. Ole B. Budsberg, an elderly widower from Iola, Wisconsin, appeared next. He was last seen alive at the LaPorte Savings Bank on April 6, 1907, when he mortgaged his Wisconsin land there, signing over a deed and obtaining several $1,000s in cash. Ole B. Budsberg's sons, Oscar and Matthew Budsberg, had no idea that their father had gone off to visit Belle. When they finally discovered his destination, they wrote to her. She promptly responded, saying she had never seen their father. Several other middle-aged men appeared and disappeared in brief visits to Belle's farm throughout 1907. Then, in December 1907, Andrew Helgelien, a bachelor farmer from Aberdeen, South Dakota, wrote to her and was warmly received. The pair exchanged many letters, until a letter that overwhelmed Helgelien, written in Belle's own careful handwriting and dated January 13, 1908. This letter was later found at the Helgelien farm. It read,
"To the dearest friend in the world, no woman in the world is happier than I am. I know that you are now to come to me and be my own. I can tell from your letters that you are the man I want. It does not take one long to tell when to like a person, and you I like better than anyone in the world, I know. Think how we will enjoy each other's company. You, the sweetest man in the whole world. We will be all alone with each other. Can you conceive of anything nicer? I think of you constantly. When I hear your name mentioned, and this is when one of the dear children speaks of you, or I hear myself humming it with the words of an old love song, it is beautiful music to my ears. My heart beats in wild rapture for you, my Andrew, I love you. Come prepared to stay forever."
In response to her letter, Helgelien flew to her side in January 1908. He had with him a check for $2,900, his savings, which he had drawn from his local bank. A few days after Helgelien arrived, he and Belle appeared at the savings bank in LaPorte and deposited the check. Helgelien vanished a few days later, but Belle appeared at the savings bank to make a $500 deposit and another deposit of $700 in the state bank. At this time, she started to have problems with Ray Lamphy. In March 1908, Belle sent several letters to a farmer and horse dealer in Topeka, Kansas named Lon Townsend, inviting him to visit her. He decided to put off the visit until spring, and thus did not see her before a fire at her farm. Belle was also in correspondence with a man from Arkansas and sent him a letter dated May 4, 1908. He would have visited her, but did not because of the fire at her farm. Belle allegedly promised marriage to a suitor Bert Albert, which did not go through because of his lack of wealth. The hired hand Ray Lamphy was deeply in love with Belle. He performed any chore for her, no matter how gruesome. he became jealous of the many men who arrived to court his employer and began making scenes. She fired him on February 3, 1908. Shortly after dispensing with Lamphy, she presented herself at the LaPorte courthouse. She declared that her former employee was not in his right mind and was a menace to the public. She somehow convinced local authorities to hold a sanity hearing. Lamphy was pronounced sane and released. Bell was back a few days later to complain to the sheriff that Lamphy had visited her farm and argued with her. She contended that he posed a threat to her family and had Lamphy arrested for trespassing. Lamphy returned again and again to see her, but she drove him away. Lamphy made thinly disguised threats. On one occasion, he confided to farmer William Slater, "Helgeline won't bother me no more. We fixed him for keeps." Helgeline had long since disappeared from the precincts of LaPorte, or so it was believed. However, his brother, Arl Helgeline, was disturbed when Andrew failed to return home, and he wrote to Bell in Indiana, asking her about his siblings' whereabouts. Bell wrote back, telling Arl Helgeline that his brother was not at her farm and probably went to Norway to visit relatives. Arl Helgeline wrote back saying that he did not believe his brother would do that. Moreover, he believed that his brother was still in the LaPorte area, the last place he was seen or heard from. Bell brazened it out. She told him that if he wanted to come and look for his brother, she would help conduct a search, but she cautioned him that searching for missing persons was an expensive proposition. If she were to be involved in such a manhunt, she stated, Arl Helgeline should be prepared to pay her for her efforts. Arl Helgeline did come to LaPorte, but not until May. Lamphy represented an unresolved danger to her. Now Arl Helgeline was making inquiries that could very well send her to the gallows. She told a lawyer in LaPorte, M.E. Leliter, that she feared for her life and that of her children. Ray Lamphy, she said, had threatened to kill her and burn her house down. She wanted to make out a will, in case Lamphy went through with his threats. Leliter complied and drew up her will. She left her entire estate to her children and then departed Leliter's offices. She went to one of the LaPorte banks holding the mortgage for her property and paid this off. She did not go to the police to tell them about Lamphy's allegedly life-threatening conduct. The reason for this, most later concluded, was that there had been no threats. She was merely setting the stage for her own arson. Joe Maxson, who had been hired to replace Lamphy in February 1908, awoke in the early hours of April 28, 1908, smelling smoke in his room, which was on the second floor of the Bell's house. He opened the hall door to a sheet of flames. Maxson screamed Bell's name and those of her children, but got no response. He slammed the door and then, in his underwear, leapt from the second-story window of his room, barely surviving the fire that was closing in around him. He raced to town to get help, but by the time the old-fashioned hook and ladder arrived at the farm at early dawn, the farmhouse was a gutted heap of smoking ruins. 4 bodies were found inside the house. One of the bodies was that of a woman who could not immediately be identified as Bell, since she had no head. The head was never found. The bodies of her children were found still in their beds. County Sheriff Smutzer had somehow heard about Lamphy's alleged threats. He took one look at the carnage and quickly sought out the ex-handyman. Leliter came forward to recount his tale about Bell's will, and how she feared Lamphy would kill her and her family and burn her house down. Lamphey did not help his cause much. At the moment Sheriff Smutzer confronted him, and before a word was uttered by the lawman, Lamphey exclaimed, "Did Widow Bell and the kids get out all right?" He was then told about the fire, but he denied having anything to do with it, claiming that he was not near the farm when the blaze occurred. A youth, John Solium, was brought forward. He said that he had been watching the Bell place and that he saw Lamphey running down the road from the Bell's house just before the structure erupted in flames. Lamphey snorted to the boy, "You wouldn't look me in the eye and say that." "Yes, I will," replied Solium. "You found me hiding behind the bushes and you told me you'd kill me if I didn't get out of there." Lamphey was arrested and charged with murder and arson. Then scores of investigators, sheriff's deputies, coroner's men and many volunteers began to search the ruins for evidence. The body of the headless woman was of deep concern to LaPorte residents. C. Christopherson, a neighboring farmer, took one look at the charred remains of this body and said that it was not the remains of Belle Gunniss. So did another farmer, L. Nicholson, and so did Mrs. Austin Cutler, an old friend of Belle. More of Belle's old friends, Mrs. Mayo Lander and Mr. Sigurd Olson, arrived from Chicago. They examined the remains of the headless woman and said it was not Belle. Doctors then measured the remains, and, making allowances for the missing neck and head, stated the corpse was that of a woman who stood 5 feet 3 inches tall and weighed no more than 150 pounds. Friends and neighbors, as well as the LaPorte clothiers who made her dresses and other garments, swore that Belle was taller than 5 feet 8 inches and weighed between 180 and 200 pounds. Detailed measurements of the body were compared with those on file with several LaPorte stores where she purchased her apparel. When the two sets of measurements were compared, the authorities concluded that the headless woman could not possibly have been Belle Gunniss, even when the ravages of the fire on the body were taken into account. The flesh was badly burned but intact. Moreover, Dr. J. Mayers examined the internal organs of the dead woman. He sent stomach contents of the victims to a pathologist in Chicago, who reported months later that the organs contained lethal doses of strychnine. Belle's dentist, Dr. IRAP Norton, said that if the teeth dental work of the headless corpse had been located, he could ascertain if it was Belle. Thus Louis Klondike Schultz, a former miner, was hired to build a sluice and begin sifting the debris. As more bodies were unearthed, the sluice was used to isolate human remains on a larger scale. On May 19, 1908, a piece of bridgework was found consisting of 2 human canine teeth, their roots still attached, porcelain teeth and gold crown work in between. Norton identified them as work done for Belle. As a result, Coroner Charles Mack officially concluded that the adult female body discovered in the ruins was Belle Gunniss. Arsel Helgelien arrived in LaPorte and told Sheriff Smutzer that he believed his brother had met with foul play at Belle's hands. Then, Joe Maxson came forward with information that could not be ignored. He told the sheriff that Belle had ordered him to bring loads of dirt by wheelbarrow to a large area surrounded by a high wire fence where the hogs were fed. Maxson said that there were many deep depressions in the ground that had been covered by dirt. These filled-in holes, Belle had told Maxson, contained rubbish. She wanted the ground made level, so he filled in the depressions. Smutzer took a dozen men back to the farm and began to dig. On May 3, 1908, the diggers unearthed the body of Jenny Olson, vanished December 1906. Then they found the small bodies of 2 unidentified children. Subsequently, the body of Andrew Helgelien was unearthed. His overcoat was found to be worn by Lamphey. As days progressed and the gruesome work continued, one body after another was discovered in Bell's hog pen. Over 38 people were reported as possible victims of hers, as they had mentioned to family and friends about meeting her, married her, or some simply said they were meeting a rich widow with 3 children who lived on a farm in LaPorte. All of which vanished soon after going to meet her. Most of the remains found on the property could not be identified. Because of the crude recovery methods, the exact number of individuals unearthed on the Gunnis farm is unknown but is believed to be approximately 12. On May 19, 1908, remains of approximately 7 unknown victims were buried in 2 coffins in unmarked graves in the paupers section of LaPorte's Pine Lake Cemetery. Andrew Helgelien and Jenny Olson are buried in LaPorte's Patton Cemetery, near Peter Gunnis. Ray Lamphey was arrested on May 22, 1908, and tried for murder and arson. He denied the charges of arson and murder that were filed against him. His defense hinged on the assertion that the body was not Bell's. Lamphey's lawyer, Wirt Worden, developed evidence that contradicted Norton's identification of the teeth and bridgework. A local jeweler testified that though the gold in the bridgework had emerged from the fire almost undamaged, the fierce heat of the conflagration had melted the gold plating on several watches and items of gold jewelry. Local doctors replicated the conditions of the fire by attaching a similar piece of dental bridgework to a human jawbone and placing it in a blacksmith's forge. The real teeth crumbled and disintegrated. The porcelain teeth came out pocked and pitted, with the gold parts rather melted. Both the artificial elements were damaged to a greater degree than those in the bridgework offered as evidence of Bell's identity. The hired hand Joe Maxson and another man also testified that they'd seen Klondike Schultz take the bridgework out of his pocket and plant it just before it was discovered. Lamphey was found guilty of arson but acquitted of murder. On November 26, 1908, he was sentenced to 20 years in state prison, in Michigan City. He died of tuberculosis on December 30, 1909. On January 14, 1910, the Reverend E. A. Shell came forward with a confession that Lamphey was said to have made to him while the clergyman was comforting the dying man. In it, Lamphey revealed Bell's crimes and swore that she was still alive. Lamphey had stated to the Reverend Shell and to a fellow convict, Harry Mayers, shortly before his death, that he had not murdered anyone, but that he had helped Bell bury many of her victims. When a victim arrived, she made him comfortable, charming him and cooking a large meal. She then drugged his coffee, and when the man was in a stupor, she split his head with a meat chopper. Sometimes she would simply wait for the suitor to go to bed and then enter the bedroom by candlelight and chloroform her sleeping victim. A powerful woman, Bell would then carry the body to the basement, place it on a table, and dissect it. She then bundled the remains and buried these in the hog pen and the grounds about the house. Bell had become an expert at dissection, thanks to the instruction she had received from her second husband, the butcher Peter Gunnis. To save time, she sometimes poisoned her victims' coffee with strychnine. She also varied her disposal methods, sometimes dumping the corpse into the hog scalding vat and covering the remains with quicklime. Lamphey even stated that if Bell was overly tired after murdering one of her victims, she merely chopped up the remains and, in the middle of the night, stepped into her hog pen and fed the remains to the hogs. The handyman also cleared up the mysterious question of the headless female corpse found in the smoking ruins of Gunness' home. Gunness had lured this woman from Chicago on the pretense of hiring her as a housekeeper only days before she decided to make her permanent escape from LaPorte. Gunness, according to Lamphy, had drugged the woman, then bashed in her head and decapitated the body, taking the head, which had weights tied to it, to a swamp where she threw it into deep water. Then she chloroformed her children, smothered them to death, and dragged their small bodies, along with the headless corpse, to the basement. She dressed the female corpse in her old clothing, and removed her false teeth, placing these beside the headless corpse to assure it being identified as Belle Gunness. She then torched the house and fled. Lamphy had helped her, he admitted, but she had not left by the road where he waited for her after the fire had been set. She had betrayed her one-time partner in crime in the end by cutting across open fields and then disappearing into the woods. Some accounts suggest that Lamphy admitted that he took her to Stillwell, a town about 9 miles from LaPorte, and saw her off on a train to Chicago. Lamphy said that Belle was a rich woman, that she had murdered 42 men by his count, perhaps more, and had taken amounts from them ranging from $1,000 to $32,000. She had allegedly accumulated more than $250,000 through her murder schemes over the years, a huge fortune for those days, about $6.3 million now. She had a small amount remaining in one of her savings accounts, but local banks later admitted that she had indeed withdrawn most of her funds shortly before the fire. The fact that Gunness withdrew most of her money suggested that she was planning to evade the law. Gunness was, for several decades, allegedly seen or sighted in cities and towns throughout the United States. Friends, acquaintances, and amateur detectives apparently spotted her on the streets of Chicago, San Francisco, New York, and Los Angeles. As late as 1931, Gunness was reported alive and living in a Mississippi town, where she supposedly owned a great deal of property. Smutzer, for more than 20 years, received an average of 2 reports a month. She became part of American criminal folklore, a female Bluebeard. The bodies of Belle's 3 children were found in the home's wreckage, but the headless adult female corpse found with them was never positively identified. Belle's true fate is unknown. LaPorte residents were divided between believing that she was killed by Lamphy and that she had faked her own death. In 1931, a woman known as Esther Carlson was arrested in Los Angeles for poisoning August Lindstrom for money. 2 people who had known Gunness claimed to recognize her from photographs, but the identification was never proved. Carlson died while awaiting trial. The body believed to be that of Belle Gunness was buried next to her first husband at Forest Home Cemetery in Forest Park, Illinois. On November 5, 2007, with the permission of descendants of Belle's sister, the headless body was exhumed from Gunness' grave in Forest Home Cemetery by a team of forensic anthropologists and graduate students from the University of Indianapolis to learn her true identity. It was initially hoped that a sealed envelope flap on a letter found at the victim's farm would contain enough DNA to be compared to that of the body. Unfortunately, there was not enough DNA there, so efforts continue to find a reliable source for comparison purposes, including the disinterment of additional bodies and contact with known living relatives. Figuring out whether or not that woman was Belle seems unlikely, and her supposed escape from justice must have been hard for the relatives and friends to come to terms with, So, believing that woman was Belle probably felt easier for them than the thought of their killer evading justice.